The crying child, Charlie, and Elizabeth. Who dies first? The death order of these three characters is one of FNAF's biggest mysteries, and is the main reason it's unanimously agreed that the beginning of the timeline is the most difficult part of the lore to solve. Today, I present what I think is a concrete answer to this question, with details you may have missed that also help solve the motivations behind William Afton. So subscribe so we can hit 250,000 subscribers before the end of the month, aka my birthday, like the video, comment your thoughts below at the end, and let's begin solving FNAF's biggest debate. Of course, remember though that this is all just a theory, and it's one that actually goes against what the majority of the community believes. So even if you disagree, just hear me out, as I might be able to convince you by the end of it. Before we begin, what is actually confirmed about these three victims? Starting back with FNAF 2, and we learn about Charlie, the child who goes on to possess the puppet, where we see that she's outside of an unspecified location and is approached by a purple car, before William Afton steps out and kills her, leaving her for dead. This same event is then reiterated in FNAF 6, but slightly different, where we see that the security puppet, an animatronic built to keep kids inside the location, and here specifically focused on Charlie, is trapped by some kids inside of its box. And so when Charlie is stuck outside of the location, it can't help her. Eventually, the security puppet frees itself and heads outside, only to eventually find Charlie's corpse on the ground with tire marks fleeing the scene, breaking down next to her and leading Charlie's soul to inhabit the machine. Then finally, in Help Wanted 2, we get confirmation that Charlie died sometime in 1983 by inputting the date into a keypad to receive the puppet memory. Moving on to FNAF 4, and we then meet the crying child, the youngest son of William Afton's, who gets bullied by his older brother Mike daily, to the point that he's eventually put into the mouth of Fredbear by Mike and his friends, his head eventually being crushed by Fredbear's bite. He's later sent to the hospital and dies there, as heard by a flat line playing in the background as he fades away into the void. We know for a fact that this all takes place sometime in 1983 as well, due to the TV playing Fredbear and Friends, having that exact copyright date on it. Then finally we get the sister location, where we learn about Elizabeth, the daughter of William Afton, who constantly wants to go see Circus Baby perform, despite her father's wishes, one day disobeying him only to be captured by Baby, and eventually dying inside the machine. This event having no later elaboration nor confirmed date, which makes things difficult when creating a timeline, as that means she could also die sometime in 1983. So with that limited information in mind, how do we craft a proper timeline with these three deaths? Well, luckily for us, there is actually more information, including a few things you might have never heard before that even made me change my own mind about this order mid-writing. The biggest piece of information that we need to talk about before anything else occurs in FNAF 6, where Henry, Charlie's father, talks about everything that's happened over these past few decades, and says something quite interesting. Quote,
"I could make myself sleep, but not yet. Not until I undo what he has done and heal this wound. A wound first inflicted on me, but then one that I let bleed out to cause all of this."
This quote immediately rings alarm bells in my mind. Scott doesn't confirm things easily and often avoids doing so, especially when it comes to the timeline. So when one of our main characters explicitly tells us this happens first in the finale of the story, well, finale when it released, it seems like Scott is trying to give us an answer to the first major event in the timeline. People often focus on the "a wound first inflicted on me" part of it, but the rest of the quote is equally as important. The start of the sentence tells us that he's talking about William's evil overall, and not just specifically murders. Then saying said evil was first inflicted onto him with Charlie's death, and then saying that her death is what actually caused the rest of the story, all of this, to occur. I personally believe this directly tells us that Charlie's death was first, being the domino that fell to cause the rest of the story to unfold. Although, is there anything else that actually backs up Charlie dying first in the timeline? Yes, a lot actually. Before we get into what his motives would be for killing Charlie first, something I believe a lot of people have forgotten about comes from FNAF 4. Within this game, the crying child meets this girl with pigtails, who explains how there's rumors that the animatronics are actually possessed, moving around on their own at night. While this does seem like just a joke or reference to the other games, it shouldn't be forgotten what Scott himself said about FNAF 4. Quote, "I guess most people assumed that I filled the game with random Easter eggs this time. I didn't," which causes me to believe that this is actually meant to be an intentional hint that an animatronic is indeed already possessed at this point in the story, which, since Elizabeth didn't exist yet only leaves Charlie's possession of the puppet. Not only that, but there's a hidden detail in the security puppet minigame which some aren't actually aware of, and that's the fact that the music track behind the minigame is called Alchemist's Fantasy. In various ages and cultures, alchemists sought out the elixir of life that supposedly grants eternal life, immortality, and miraculously cures diseases. So calling Charlie's death an alchemist's fantasy appears to be hinting that her death and then possession of the puppet is actually the reason William first learns of and seeks out the supernatural, leading to him eventually creating the fun times and the experiments underground to research it. Also, it's commonly assumed that after the crying child dies in the mouth of Fredbear with various witnesses, Fredbear's family diner closes down, and the company blames it on Springlock failures, despite that obviously not being the reason, similar to how William blames Circus Babies being cancelled on gas leaks to cover up Elizabeth's death. Although that then conflicts with the fact that Charlie actually dies at the open and operational Fredbear's family diner, as explicitly told to us within the original novel trilogy, and hinted at through the games themselves, meaning she'd have to die before his bite causes the location to close. This would also make sense with the fact that in FNAF 2, Phone Guy states,
we're going to try to contact the original restaurant owner. I think the name of the place was Fredbear's Family Diner or something like that.
Implying there's only one owner of Fredbear's by the end of its run, which can actually be explained away with Henry likely leaving the company after his daughter dies there, while the crying child's death then leads it to be closed for good, which again would be similar to how William also closes Circus Babies after his child dies there too. Not only that, but the puppet is specifically missing from those minigames, despite both Freddy Fazbear's Pizza and Fredbear's Family Diner being open at the same time when the minigames take place, which could be hinting towards the fact that after Charlie's death and the puppet's malfunction, they decided to put the puppet out of service for now, it only returning when the 1987 location opens up. But going back to the novel trilogy I just mentioned though, and while those 3 books do take place in another timeline, they also give us information on the story of the games, and especially the characters, including our main villain, William Afton. As I just mentioned, within the novel trilogy we learn that while Fredbear's Family Diner was open, William kidnaps and murders Charlie first. But why? What are William's motives behind killing her? Well, in the Silver Eyes we read that while police are searching his house, they find, quote, stacks of journals full of raving paranoia, passages about Henry that range from wild jealousy to near worship, hinting that William actually killed Charlie due to his insane jealousy of Henry, in order to basically ruin him and to break who William seemingly thought of as a perfect man. This in itself, along with the FNAF movie, shows us that William doesn't actually need to have a child of his own die in order to have the motive or to be pushed over the edge to kill Charlie, instead showing us that jealousy alone was enough to make him murder Charlie, and here explicitly kill her first in the story, with the trilogy continuing to show that Elizabeth is killed after Charlie too. It's important to keep in mind that FNAF 4 and The Silver Eyes were being written at the same time, the book releasing only a couple months after FNAF 4's release, and so it would be quite confusing for William's motivations for his first kill to be because of his kid in any effect, but at the same time release a book directly telling us that it has nothing to do with his children. A lot of people believe the crying child dies first mainly due to the fact that it gives William a motive to kill Charlie out of jealousy, but as I just explained, we have the source directly telling us that William already has that jealousy towards Henry as his motive for killing Charlie before anyone else even dies. Finally, a relatively smaller piece of evidence is this image from Stillwell Studios that was in Help Wanted 2, showing the 4 Freddy's characters at a full fest as well as the puppet in the background. Now, the only full fest that we actually know of are the 70s Full Fest that we get a poster of in Help Wanted 2, as well as Full Fest 83 that we see in Curse of Dreadbear. And considering these are Freddy's characters and we know that the Freddy's location opened up in 1983, I think it's safe to say that this is meant to be showing us the Full Fest of 83. But why does this matter? Well, because the puppet is actually dead in the background, here as a scarecrow specifically, which implies that by the time the Full Fest of 83 is still happening, Charlie is already dead. And I think this is actually important because that very Full Fest is everywhere in the Curse of Dreadbear DLC, which happens to heavily connect it to FNAF 4 and the Crying Child, with the Afton house on the hill, Dreadbear being the Frankenstein version of Fredbear, the purple car representing William, and Grim Foxy representing Michael, etc, etc. I believe that this is showing us that the Crying Child's death occurs while the Full Fest of 83 is still happening, later in the year, and by that time Charlie is already dead. I would say it could be any Fall Fest in any year, but we exclusively only know of 2, and both would imply that Charlie dies before the crying child. Before we figure out who dies next, a common reason for people believing the crying child dies before Charlie is that a lot of people seem to think that the bite of 83 is what causes Henry to make the security puppet, so his child doesn't also die, and therefore Charlie would have to die after the crying child. However, this can actually be disproven. Not only can a security system be put in place without a prior event causing it, but the whole purpose of the security puppet is that it's actually stopping kids, and mainly Charlie, from leaving the location and actually keeping them inside with the animatronics, which doesn't really work with the theory that it's meant to be protecting her from them and stopping her from being bitten. If that were the case, it would be instead next to the stage itself to direct the children away, not keep them in. Another reason people believe the crying child dies before Charlie is due to the fact that in the original novel trilogy, Charlie is kidnapped on Halloween, being reported the next day on November 1st, while the minigames seem to show that the crying child's death happens in the summer, although I think it's equally as important to call out that it was stated Charlie was kidnapped on Halloween in 1982 in that book. There's a reason I didn't use that old date for Charlie's death in this video, because while it would technically confirm that she's meant to be the first, dying a whole year before the crying child, it was changed to simply 1983 by the Fourth Closet, that date also showing up in Help Wanted 2. Her death date changing cannot be ignored by either side. So now we have pretty solid ground to stand on to state that Charlie dies first in the timeline, due to William's insane jealousy of Henry. So who's next? Well, luckily I actually think this one is a whole lot easier to solve. In fact, I think we can using only one simple piece of evidence. In Sister Location, when resetting the power to the location, we're presented with this map, showing Circus Baby's entertainment and rentals, as well as 3 other connected underground locations, here titled Observations. As you probably know by this point, these are experiment chambers created by William Afton based around the crying child, evident with his path to Fredbear's family diner being recreated and the 1983 code, in order to further research the supernatural and, likely due to the agony-filled Fredbear plush which we do actually see William now has sitting in this office, researching agony specifically. The Funtime animatronics seem to have also been created specifically for capturing children, to eventually take them to William to use for his research. Although like I mentioned, these experiments seem to be based around the crying child's life specifically, meaning he's trying to recreate what happened to him, which inherently means that he's already dead by this point in time, meaning that he's second. This would actually add on to the evidence for Charlie dying first when you keep his motivations in mind. Why would he recreate the crying child's life and from that point on be focused on experimenting with the supernatural with the fun times, experiments, and then the missing children's incident, but then randomly stop in his tracks and kill Charlie outside with nothing she could even attach herself to? Charlie's death is completely unrelated to William's motivations after the crying child's death, and it breaks the pattern that everything after his death is to experiment with and learn about the supernatural, which he pays the ultimate price for, with Elizabeth unfortunately being taken instead, the third death. This creates an interesting story, and we actually have proof that his experimental nature continues after Elizabeth's death as well. Think about it, William actually succeeded in his research, despite losing Elizabeth, as now he knows Baby is possessed with her newly green eyes, and so he seemingly uses all of this research to commit the missing children's incident, stuffing the bodies inside the animatronics, similar to what happened to Elizabeth, which successfully works and causes them to all be possessed. Years later, it appears he's still experimenting, killing another 5 kids to test if they'll still go on to possess the animatronics, despite him now putting their bodies outside/around the suits, instead of being stuffed inside, which works once again. We even know after this he's still experimenting, as later in the story we know he burns down the original animatronics, to manipulate their remnant as a controlled substance to use to get them to possess the fun times. So it does actually seem that after the crying child dies, his suspicions on the supernatural from the puppet's possession is now confirmed, and so his pure focus from that point on is trying to learn about and experiment with the supernatural, requiring the crying child to die before Elizabeth, and accidentally giving more evidence to Charlie dying before the crying child, to keep William's motives consistent from his death forward. Although something I know will be mentioned in the comments if I don't speak on it now, is that back in FNAF 4 we see an empty girl's room in the Afton house. So doesn't this prove that Elizabeth dies before him? Well, not only did Elizabeth as a character not even exist at that point in time, considering FNAF 4 was the final game in the series originally, but I actually think that it's likely that this is instead meant to be Mrs. Afton's room, telling us that she has now been fully pushed out of the family and or is dead at this point in the story, explaining where the mother is while the crying child is just roaming around the streets on his own. Although there are other explanations some use if it's Elizabeth's room, mainly that she's either the pigtail girl teasing her brother, or that she's simply with a nanny or something since she's still so young. Something I also know will be mentioned is the infamous Midnight Motorist. What does this tell us about the Death Order? Unfortunately, not much. There are so many interpretations for this minigame. It could be about the crying child being lured and running to Charlie or Elizabeth's grave. It could be about Michael being lured and running to the crying child's grave, etc, etc. There's honestly an interpretation ready for whoever you believe dies before it, so it doesn't really help us here. Another thing I know will be mentioned is what the crying child potentially saw, as some believe that he actually saw a corpse, whether it was Charlie's or Elizabeth's, which of course would change the Death Order, although I heavily believe that Scott already gave us an answer for this. Quote, "What is seen in the shadows is easily misunderstood in the mind of a child," which I think is hinting towards the fact that the crying child thought he saw something horrific that was probably something normal instead, which is likely in reference to this secret in FNAF 4, where we see William helping an employee get into a suit. The crying child saw this and misunderstood what was happening, assuming that the employee was actually being stuffed into the suit or eaten by the suit or something like that, and causing his fears of the animatronics. So, with all of this information in mind, my final conclusion is that William Afton kills Charlie first, at Fredbear's family diner due to his raving paranoia and insane jealousy towards Henry, Charlie possessing the puppet shortly after, and William possibly noticing this. Then the crying child is bullied by Mike, him pouring his agony into his Fredbear plush, which continues up to his birthday at Fredbear's family diner, where he gets put into Fredbear's mouth and crushed, leading him to be sent to the hospital, and ends up being guided by her to likely possess Fredbear. The second death. William eventually notices the supernatural stuff going on with the puppet, and it's now confirmed with the Fredbear plush. So he then creates experiments underground to research the supernatural, and it's basically all he does from this point forward, creating the fun times to be able to capture children for said experiments. Although this backfires when Elizabeth is the one who is captured instead, later dying inside and then possessing Circus Baby, the third death, making the order Charlie, crying child, and then Elizabeth. Let me know your thoughts on all of this in the comment section below, and I hope you all enjoyed this theory whether you agree or disagree. Just think on it and come to your own conclusions. Special thanks to the Grey_ for some advice for this video, and subscribe because next video I'm going to solve what Scott's one confirmed retcon really is. And I'm actually able to show you the exact moment that it was retconned from the story that we all missed. Meaning, unlike the other solving FNAF videos like this next one might actually be solved and confirmed by Scott himself.